Welcome back here to In the Circle. Eric Lopez alongside Justin McLeod of the Dugout Digest. He was with us on the last episode, of course, as typical. You know he's back healthy because we went long. What do we go, an hour?
I'm pretty sure if memory serves, I think we went about an hour just on that one and didn't really touch the coaching carousel at all.
Did not even get a chance to talk. So he's back with us just to talk about our traditional coaching carousel, which maybe that speaks volumes, Justin. The fact that we spent an hour of talking some of the big stories in 2023 and the coaching carousel did not come up. I mean, what does that say about the year that was in the coaching movement?
It says a lot. The coaching carousel was a very interesting thing this year. It's been a hot minute since I've seen a carousel like this. I'll tell you, every year I do top 10 lists ranking the 10 best head coaching hires, the 10 best assistant coaching hires, all those things. This is probably the most difficulty I have had in ranking those lists. I'm not going to lie to you. For one of those lists, I had trouble coming up with 10 initially. Like it was just a struggle, and I had to look at what factors I was looking at and what factors I was not considering. It was a very strange, very wacky, and at times very underwhelming year on the coaching carousel.
Which, little did we know, would not wrap up until the week before Christmas, which we got it. We already addressed that in the last episode. If you're looking for the Oklahoma State story, which Justin broke. Have you ever broken a story that close to Christmas, by the way?
God, no, and I don't ever want to again.
Fair enough.
I'm
So
not. I'm not even. I'm the scoops guy. I'm not even going to sit here and pretend the answer is anything but that.
Fair enough. All right, so let's get into the coaching movement. This is where we talk about some of the head coaching moves and the assistant moves as well that we think will make a big impact. Some moves that we're wondering if it'll work or not, and perhaps some under the radar ones that people might be not thinking about that might be a big payoff. So let's begin. In your opinion, when I say the biggest coaching move in 2023 was blank, how do you fill that up with?
Oh, I was not ready for that one. Are we talking head coaches only or across the board?
Let's go across the board. I'm curious which one, because every year, would you agree, every year in the coaching carousel, there's a defined move that will define the offseason. There's a big move, whether it be, hey, the year Caitlin Lowe took over for Mike Kendra, or Tony Baldwin took over for Lou Harris Champer, or the year that Jessica Allister went to Stanford, or the year that Mike White went to Oregon to Texas. You know, those were moves that helped define that coaching carousel season, right? That type of impact. Last year, for example, I think, would you not agree, it was Trisha Ford going to Texas A&M was a move that helped define last year's coaching carousel that people were still talking about. Those type of impact moves. Obviously, there's assistant moves over the years that have also made similar impacts as well. Think of a Chris Malvo going to Tennessee a couple years back. That was a big impact move as well. Think back to other assistant moves like Tony Baldwin's hires to the assistants there, bring it over from Washington there as well.
Thank you,
JT,
Miko.
thank you. I was struggling there for a moment. So there's been moves on both sides that have had big impacts that help define. What would be yours for 2023?
Well, I can answer the question. I'll answer the question, but I will say I don't think there is such a move in this offseason. I will say that I think the coaching carousel was in such a state this season, this summer. I don't think there is that defining move right now. Now, some new head coach comes out and wins 50 games this year. Some assistant coach comes out and improves the batting average by 150 points, something like that. Sure, that move will probably be the one that defines it in history. Right now, as we sit here at the end of the year, I don't have a move that truly fits that bill. I will say, after thinking about it, there are probably two that pop into my head that could fit that. One is Donna Papa retiring at North Carolina and Megan Smith Lang being hired to replace her as the head coach in Chapel Hill. The other for me is probably Bryce Neal being hired as an assistant at LSU and breaking up what was one of the longest, or not, he didn't break it up, but being the new guy after the one of the longest tenured coaching staffs in the country was broken up. I'm going to say both, and DJ Gasso going to Arkansas as the hitting coach. I guess I'm going to cheat and add one more at the 11th hour. Those are the ones that pop into my mind, but I really don't believe there's any that fit that bill right now. Like I mentioned, it was an off season that to me brought potential in different places, like some of those moves that I just mentioned, like at Arkansas, like at LSU. But I don't think there's a move that I can sit here and would call an absolutely defining move, an absolute gold mine for the team that made it. As we sit here at the end of the year, not knowing what the on the field will hold.
Right, that could play itself out as time goes on. Let's start with the head coaches.
Yep.
You brought up Megan Smith Lyon, North Carolina. To me, the other one that stands out, Lindsay Leftwich, taking over at NC State for the reasons you mentioned. She's leaving Beth Torina, first longtime assistant there. I think those two moves are fascinating to see how that works out with North Carolina and North Carolina State both in their first year. So there's going to be that comparison right from day one of those two. Talk about those two moves. What you think of those two hires?
Well, first of all, Lindsay Leftwich leaving the staff at LSU after all that time, I don't think anybody expected it. I mean, I think everybody thought that LSU staff would be together till Jesus comes back. Not really, but you understand the point. They were together for so long, been to so many different World Series, things like that. For Lindsay Leftwich to step out, take that head coaching job in Raleigh, take over at NC State, a rebuilding job, a program that was in particular disarray in the months before she took over. Um, I mean, her for her first head coaching job, she picked a spot. I think it's a spot that has a lot of potential for her to step into. Um, but it's a spot that needed somebody like Leftwich to step in, somebody who honestly very similar to Beth Torina and how they run a program, but also somebody with the recruiting connections and just the longevity and just being known. Like Leftwich stepping in at NC State changed so many different aspects of that NC State program. She was so different from the last two head coaching hires that NC State had made just in background, just in pedigree. Excuse me. If you think about it, the last two head coaching hires were Northeast head coaches. Lindsay Leftwich is a career assistant coach in the South. Well, an assistant coach who spent her career in the South, I should say. So I think that one's a potentially very high reward move. And then you go to Chapel Hill. The way the UNC played out their coaching search was interesting. Donna Papa's contract was expiring. I think it was kind of pretty widely known she was expected to retire. She got the appropriate flowers for someone who had a career as long as she did and led UNC for what she did and to what she did. You get Megan Smith Lyon, a program alum. She's probably said it 10,000 times since she got to Chapel Hill, Tar Heel born and bred. They kept it in the family. It's something that UNC likes to do. And Megan Smith Lyons had success. I mean, Marshall fans were not happy with me last year when I talked about the strength of schedule and the fact that they were not playing a lot of high quality opponents. But you know what Megan Smith Lyon did a lot of, no matter the schedule, was she won a lot last year. She won a good chunk of games when she was at Marshall. She was the fastest, I believe it was to 150 wins in Marshall program history. She had a lot of success there at Kansas as a head coach. She had some success early on. She's been around. She's been at LSU. She started the program at Western Carolina. Megan Smith's been around for a hot minute. And she's going to put everything she's got into that UNC program because of the pride she has in it. So that's one of those things where, yes, Chapel Hill kept it in the family. They brought in a Tar Heel, but at the same time, they brought in somebody who's got a track record of some success. Now, I'm gonna need to see a schedule a little higher in RPI now that she's in the Power Five. But if that's my biggest gripe about somebody, I think she's done pretty okay. If my biggest gripe is that she didn't play a hearty schedule last year, I think she's done some pretty solid things otherwise. If that's what I go to if I'm trying to find a fault. So for Chapel Hill, I think it was a nice combination of, yes, bringing in somebody familiar, bringing in somebody who knows the history, who loves the program, who's Tar Heel born and bred, while also bringing in somebody with a resume they can brag about. That combination is not always easily attainable, and UNC attained it. So I think both places have potential with these new head coaches to do something solid, be factors in the ACC in the short or the long term.
There weren't a lot of head coaching changes in general, especially in the Power Five. I think we had what, three in the ACC that kind of led the way among the Power Fives. Um, what do you make of that? Is that stability? Is it just a random coincidence? Just one of those years? What do you make of the? I don't want to say lack of movement because there was still a lot of moves, but you're right. Compared to the last few years, there wasn't as many big moves, at least in the major conferences.
Well, my answer is going to sound like I'm speaking as the Scoops guy. I'm not. Just from what it means for softball, I don't like it. I don't think it bodes well for us. I think we saw some coaches who really, really probably should have been moved on from or should have moved on that instead have contract extensions that instead were kept around for the time being and things like that. Um, I'm not going to, but I could give you a list and it would take me both hands. I don't think that bodes well for softball because it shows to me, some people would say it shows faith from an athletic director and a coach. It does. It's potentially good intentions by an athletic director to show that faith and give a coach more time somewhere. But we also know what good intentions have paid, to use an old colloquialism. Um, I don't think it bodes well for the sport in some senses. Now, there are other places where, you know what, a move could have happened that may have even had some cascading impact, where an athletic director instead decided not to be transactional and kept a coach around, or said, no, I'm not going to pay a buyout. I want you to coach, or I'm going to let you coach, and things like that. The fact that we had the lack of movement that we did, and I'm not going to lie to you, the way some of the moves that were made do not bode well for where we are as a sport and how we are seen in some athletic departments and by some athletic administrators. It's not a positive. I understand that people in the coaching profession or people that advocate for the coaching profession are going to disagree with me. You're allowed to. I'm sure it's in the Bible somewhere that everybody's entitled to be wrong.
Well, let me ask you
but
this:
but it doesn't bode well.
how much of it is all the uncertainty with the realignment? We spent a lot of time on realignment in the last episode when we had you on. I don't want to get into the realignment, but I'm sure that's a factor. And you don't, with the finance uncertainties, as you're making a changing leagues or the leagues are growing and all that, that probably has played a factor too. Where sometimes, like, I don't know if I feel comfortable making a move right now until I know what we're in for in a year or two.
Well, I understand your point, but also we have seen some athletic directors who went to more effort to extend a contract or to not make a change. When you're talking about coaches and contract years, it costs $0 to find a new coach. If you let a contract expire, you know what? You may have feel like you have to promise facility upgrades. You may have to promise a raise, an assistant pool bump, or something like that. But you know what? You also might not. It costs $0 to make a change. And if you've got a coach who has not shown improvement, who has not progressed, who has not shown a reason for you to have faith in them, why would you have that faith in them? The answer is, I think we are starting to go back to a point where athletic directors and athletic departments don't have as much care for softball as they once did. We had a really nice run of, I guess, 3, 4, 5 years where that wasn't the case. We had a really nice run where people paid attention to softball. We saw the money investment from a salaries and a facility standpoint. We're still seeing some investment from the facilities, especially, and occasionally from the salary. But I think we are looking now at a spot where the sport of softball is where we're starting to backslide, to use an old, I don't know who else uses it, but it was a very prominent word in the Southern Baptist Church when I was growing up. We're starting to backslide as a sport in the significance with which athletic departments and athletic directors see us as a sport. You know, you think about it 4 years ago, maybe pre-COVID, maybe right after COVID, but we were softball. You needed to win. I needed to see that improvement as an athletic director, or I was going to look at making a change. Now we're seeing apathy. We're seeing apathy in moves that are made and moves that are not made. And I don't think it bodes well for us as a sport at all.
Well, and we got into the whole realignment and the impact on softball and how it could be really bad. I think the other thing, from an NIL standpoint, you're seeing more and more schools now saying, "Hey, let's support NIL," but where is that? Where are they pushing that money to go to? Football players, right, and basketball players in some schools there. So all of a sudden, you can't spread the wealth everywhere, right? In as well as maybe some should be. So I'm wondering if that has also played an impact that, hey, I just don't have the resources or the money to push into softball because my football coach needs a linebacker and he needs this endorse. So I need my money people or people that donate to the kingdom or donate to whatever your collective was, go towards a specific sport in general, whatever you want to call the collectives. Everybody has a collective name now in every school. So I don't know. We could spend hours on that topic, but we've already had you for 2 episodes. So the new year is coming, as you know, Justin. So
so quicker and quicker.
Yeah, before you know the year will over be here, we're still talking. Give me your favorite hire of the off season.
Head coach.
Yeah, let's go head coach. Let's stay on the head coach, and then we'll move to assistants. Yeah,
I'm gonna say Lacey Prejean at Northwestern State.
Ooh,
Little under the radar. So if and when you ask me that question later, I may throw Lacey Prejean. I may change it up and throw somebody else out at you. But I really like that move. You know, Northwestern State had Donald Pickett as head coach for what seemed like forever. He decides to leave, move back closer to home in East Tennessee. In Northwestern State, Natchitoches is not going to be everybody's cup of tea. It's a small town in Western Louisiana. You're not going to just be able to bring anybody in. It needs somebody that knows the culture, that can fit in. Lacey Prejean fits in. You bring her off the Louisiana Lafayette staff. She was with the Raging Cajuns, with Gary Glasgow, just coming off a super regional. And if you think about it, Lacey Prejean's been a part, while at ULL even, she's been a part of a lot of things that have happened there, a lot of transfers, moving from the transfers to the freshmen, different things that have gone on that Prejean has been a part of. Even things as simple as, you know what, Jerry Glasgow's coached a couple of pro teams since he's been the head coach of the Cajuns. Prejean at times was the most senior coach physically in Lafayette. So does that mean she had a lot of different things to do? I'm not saying that, but I do think there's some significance to things like that just not every coach has experienced. She's in state. Her loyalty's in state. I mean, her name is Prejean. Anybody from Louisiana, I mean, a name like Prejean is a Louisiana name. And I think for Northwestern State to pull in a Louisiana lady, somebody who's been around, an experienced coach, a successful coach, I think it's really, really promising for Northwestern State. I think it's a good move for Prejean to be a head coach there in Natchitoches. Kind of jealous she's there to see all the Christmas lights right now, the kind of famous ones there in Natchitoches. I really like that move. I think it's a lot of upside on both sides, and I don't know that there's a lot of downside, to be honest. I really like that move.
I like Lauren Karn to Maryland. I know it was late. It was late in the process with Mark Montgomery parting away from Maryland. It was hired in the fall. But I've been a fan of Lauren Karn since I've seen her at Oakland, obviously do what she do there. And if they give her proper time, I think she'll do pretty well at Maryland. I think that's a nice under the radar move that we might look back and say, wow, that they really hit one there, considering it was late in the process.
No, I mean Lauren Karn did a really nice job at Oakland. Couple of conference championships, NCAA tournament, Sydney Campbell's progression there. And honestly, I mean, I'll give Lauren Karn props for Sydney Campbell sticking around. Karn was her pitching coach at Oakland. Campbell was really successful, Horizon League Pitcher of the Year, never transferred out. I think there's something to be said for that from Campbell's perspective. But I'll also give Karn some props for it because if the two of them had not meshed, if that was not a good experience for Campbell, she could have been gone. So I mean, it's the day and age in which we live that you have to talk about something like that. But I do think that's a positive feather in Karn's cap as well.
Where do you rank her as far if you did like a top 5 head coaching hires? Where would you rank her?
Well, I always do top 10.
Oh,
I do
okay.
have her in my top 10. Um, I can't give away all my secrets, but I can tell you she's not top 5 for me. She's somewhere between 6 and 10. You have to subscribe to the Dugout Digest to find out where.
Your plug. There's the plug. Give me a coaching hire, head coaching hire that you're kind of curious how it's gonna play out. You're like, ooh, it might work out, but you're still kind of not totally. You're kind of like, I gotta see this. I don't know about that. What? Give me a coaching hire that you're curious to see how it plays out.
Can I throw half the country to answer that question?
I don't think we have that much time on the
Um,
pod. So
no, I mean, without insult intended, it's got to be Purdue. I mean, it's got to be Purdue. You're talking about a Big Ten school um, that fired a head coach, fired a first assistant, did some semblance of a coaching search, if you want to call it that. Um, I mean, I don't know that I would call it that, but if you want to call it that, um, whatever they did, just to hire a second assistant who was already on staff. Um, I, I, I don't have a lot to say about it. You know me, I'm very straightforward. I don't know for Zodi personally. I've never actually talked to her, to be honest with you. So just strictly from an on paper, looking at the move, looking at the rationale for the move, I don't understand it. I will say that's one of the moves that I referenced in talking about the apathy that athletic departments have towards softball right now. Um, that one to me is the one that is circled with a big red dot. And how is this move going to go long term? I don't know. It could be tremendously successful. We could be sitting here in 3 years and produce a team worth something. And I'm like, you know what? That didn't make any sense at the time, but look at how it's turned out. The one thing I'll say that Frizzoti's got going for the bar at Purdue, based on their recent history, is extremely low. So the thing she's got going for is making incremental progress, just getting a little bit better at a time, having a good recruiting class, just winning some conference games, making the conference incremental progress is a win for her at Purdue as a head coach, certainly starting out. So that's a positive for her. You don't have to go win 30 games. You don't have to go finish in the top even 2/3 of conference. Make the conference tournament. Scoot in. Just win the right number of games. Maybe not even in the first year scoot in. Maybe just win more conference games. That's a positive in her favor. That certainly is the first move that I'm very curious to see how that goes. And I'm very curious.
other notable head coaching moves before we move on. Van Studerman's back as a head
Yep.
coach at UTSA. Morgan Zirkle back at her alma mater as Marshall, taking over at Marshall. That's an interesting one to see. I'm curious how that goes, considering such a young staff,
Very
and
young
she's
staff.
so young. I'm interested to see. We've had her on. We'll see how that goes at
Let,
Marshall.
let's also note that whole staff, 3 of the 4 members of that Marshall coaching staff, are also still planning to play professionally.
Correct. That she told us
Um,
that
and
here on
and
the show.
and
Yeah.
to me, that's a very, very high risk. I'm not sure of the potential for the rewards. I'm very curious how that specifically is going to play into that staff's tenure there too.
Agreed. I'm intrigued to see how that plays itself out. I agree with that um, as well on that move. Any other moves that we should mention before we move on to assistants?
Well, you mentioned Lauren Carter, the only Power Five we haven't mentioned. Jenny Allard going to Pitt,
Coming
going
from
there,
Harvard.
coming from Harvard, a Hall of Famer, reuniting with her old Michigan teammate Heather Life, the athletic director there at Pitt. That's the only Power Five move we didn't mention, so that would be probably the only other one.
More moves, obviously, was in the assistant level, and rightfully so. This was the first year where they had, now you could have 3 full time assistants instead of just 2. How big of an impact did you see that make this offseason, having that extra full time assistant? How would you analyze that?
More than I think I expected in year one. There are several programs that either can't hire that role until maybe next year, or maybe had to fundraise for the role. It wasn't just going to be added to the payroll, so to speak. So I was really unsure of how it was going to impact across the board. But I think it's interesting. We've seen quite a few mid majors add that role. Granted, some of them are low paid, some of them are still, hey, we'll pay you this base and then the rest in camps, like the old volunteer assistant setup. But there's still a lot of schools that have added that role on a paid basis. And I'm going to say full time, maybe not making a full time salary because of the camp supplement, but on a full time basis, they've added the fourth assistant, not just a volunteer. So I think it's actually made a bigger impact than I was expecting. I think we've seen some schools that took good advantage of that role to bring in a coach that was really worth something, hire from outside, bring in somebody who can contribute maybe in a role that wasn't there with a three-person staff, or maybe to enhance a as an aspect of the team that was there and just make it better. So I actually I think it's made a bigger impact than I was expecting it to be honest, in the first year.
And that could be what defines this coaching carousel. It's more about the assistants than the head coaches, with
Yeah.
all the tons of the
Yeah.
moves there. Uh, in your view, the biggest assistant coaching hire was what?
Ooh, you want me to give away my secrets again? Um, this one's a little easier for me. I think I'm gonna go Josh Bloomer going to Arizona. For me, the biggest reason why he sneaks over a couple of others that were very difficult for me to determine, but I think maybe the biggest reason why is technically Bloomer fills that fourth paid coach spot out at Arizona. Arizona's offense was already pretty good. They were good. You bring in Bloomer, you look at what he did as a head coach in high school, you look at what he did at Duke, even in 1 year at South Carolina, that offense looked better. They were better. You bring in a Bloomer to Arizona, an offense that's already successful. I think that's huge for Arizona. If you can take the Carly Scoopins and the Ali Skaggs and whoever else to the next level in this 1 year, like if he can do it quickly, that's huge for Arizona, both in the Pac-12 and getting ready for the Big 12 and returning to the tournament and just being a national contender again. That's a huge deal for Arizona. So for me, I think Bloomer probably tops that list. Like I say, there are a couple of others that I think he kind of squeaks into that top spot over. Because there were certainly some more than one majorly impactful move. But for me, Bloomer probably tops the list.
Let's get into some names. Since you brought up Arizona, I will kind of decide to bring up the West Coast a little bit. My number one of my top picks is Victoria Haywood, going back to
Mm-hmm.
Washington, coming over from what she did at San Diego State under Stacey Newman. I have her at the top of assistants. I think if she wants to, she could be a top-notch head coach uh, in a big program. Do you agree with me on Victoria Haywood there as far as making a big impact?
No, I do actually. I think it's the best hire Heather Carr's made in a long time.
Hmm.
She's brought some alumni back, but I think Hayward, just like you say, with the what she did at San Diego State and how that program developed and progressed. And she's still young. So you're talking about somebody who's not got, it's not like Hayward's got a decade of coaching experience under her here. She's got a handful of years. And for that success to be there, and then for Heather Tarr to bring, the prodigal daughter back home, so to speak, just to bring Hayward back to her alma mater, I think it's a huge deal. And I think it's a huge deal for Washington and Washington's hitters. I do. I really like that. I'm not going to give you any more who's where in my rankings, but I'll tell you, Hayward's
No,
very
that's why
much in the top
I will
three.
I will just bring up names and you can go whatever direction you want to go with it. You mentioned this man. You mentioned this one earlier. DJ Gasso
Mm-hmm.
to Arkansas, coming over
Yep.
from Utah. Obviously, he knows Coach Steifel from their Oklahoma days. Big impact. We saw what he did at Utah. Now he's over at Arkansas to perhaps be that difference maker to get Arkansas to OKC.
Huge impact. The potential there, I think, is probably the biggest deal for me. Arkansas's offense and what they had 2 years ago, and to just fall short of the Women's College World Series in that super regional against Texas. We kind of saw, obviously, they lose so many players after that year. Then we saw that offense really, to me, backtrack last season. I think we saw that offense take a step back a little bit for understandable reasons. You had some players in position that they weren't used to being in. You had a Hannah Gamble who just was an All American now. Instead of playing to be an All American, she was defending being an All American, so to speak. And so there were just different aspects that Arkansas offense that, again, I'll use the phrase that backslid a little bit. So I think DJ Gasso coming in, that fresh look, that renewed approach, that energy he brings, I think it's got huge potential for Arkansas. I think especially, and then add to it a couple of transfers they brought in, the players they have. I think it's a huge deal for Arkansas. I think there's a lot. I keep using the word potential, but I think that potential is the piece of it to me that's the most promising.
Let's go over some of the other the conferences, and let's stay with the SEC as far as movement is concerned. You mentioned DJ to Arkansas. Florida made a lot of changes. Chelsea Dobbins now is the new pitching coach at Florida. Mike Bosch gone out at NC State there. Francesca Anea joins the staff, coming over from the broadcast booth to the staff. Alabama adds Caleb Bro, who was from the broadcast standpoint, to the conference. I'm curious. Let's start Bro and Francesca Anea. Your thoughts on those two? Now getting into coaching, we lose out as media colleagues. I lose literally somebody next to me for a game.
Your broadcast part.
Yeah. Give me your reaction to that. Francesca at Florida, Caleb Bro at Alabama.
I think the biggest thing with those two is I don't think we can judge either of them very quickly because neither of them has coached collegiately before. Caleb Bro, obviously, especially stepping into Alabama to replace Allie Habbott's, on the staff, obviously got a lot of hype when she came in. I don't think it's fair to either of them, to Anea or to Bro, either one, to judge them very quickly. They've never done it, and it's a very different thing than anything they have done. It's a very different thing than scouting for broadcast. It's a very different thing than giving private lessons and all that kind of a thing. That to me is the biggest deal, is tampering expectations. Long term, they both have a lot of potential. They were both incredible hitters in their own right when they played. They're both, trusted. They don't have to gain the trust of the head coach. They've those head coach Patrick Murphy at Bama, Tim Walton at Florida. They trust their respective new hires. Murphy trusts Bro, Walton trusts Anea. That's a big deal. You don't have to come in and build that; it's already there. So the ground floor is laid for it to be pretty promising. But I do think it's key that the initial whatever happens, if Florida's offense is not amazing, if Alabama's short game and their outfielders are not amazing, I don't think we can judge those hires that quickly. I think there's going to need to be a learning curve period to a certain extent in both cases. But the long-term potential, I'll use that word again, is absolutely there.
Well, and it's worth mentioning Alabama Arbor, right? Adam Arbor is the hitting coach. Patrick Murphy told us. And then obviously you still got Eric Thomas over running the offense at Florida. Both are third assistants. I think Chelsea Dobbins, back to her, I think she's a significant hire, considering what she is inheriting, that young pitching staff, and the future of that Florida program is in that circle with Keegan Rothrock and it's literally the youngest pitching staff I can remember. And Chelsea Dobbins is in charge of developing those pitchers, Justin.
No, that's exactly it. Florida's pitching staff is 3 freshmen and a 5th-year graduate transfer that came out of nowhere, to be honest with you. She was already in I believe it's the Doctor of Physical Therapy program at Florida. Like, that's Florida's pitching staff entering the 2024 season. And before Mackenzie Wooten, the aforementioned 5th-year senior, came about, it was 3 freshmen. And oh, by the way, one of those 3 freshmen was a commit flip this summer. Olivia Miller had signed to go to Ole Miss. Ole Miss goes through assistant coaching changes. Miller gets out of her NLI and signs to go to Florida right away. So what Florida's pitching staff could have looked like was Ava Brown and Keegan Rothrock and Ava Brown and Keegan Rothrock. Like that's what it could have been. It's not though. It's 4 arms, 3 freshmen, and Mackenzie Wooten. And you're right. Chelsea Dobbins is in charge now. Chelsea Dobbins is sitting there with 3 true freshmen, including 2 highly prized recruits, and Wooten, who 5th-year senior. She's kind of there just to help out from an innings perspective. It's Chelsea Dobbins' show. We know what the Florida offense is capable of. Sure, they still have to perform. Florida's fortunes almost ride or die with what Chelsea Dobbins is going to be able to get out of that bullpen, out of that pitching staff. It's a hugely impactful hire. And I think it's a credit to Tim Walton that he ultimately went with someone who has been around a minute, who's not a big name that's never coached before in this position, that he picked somebody who, has shepherded a pitching staff before, who's had some success, who's got a resume that he can look at and say, okay, you're capable of doing this. I think that's a major credit to Tim Walton that he went out and found somebody like that, and that's who he ultimately decided on, because that's what you need with a staff like he's got.
You mentioned earlier that this offseason in part was defined by the amount of pitching coach changes, hires, etc. But this is one example. Another example in the league is Taryn Mowat going to Mississippi State, which I love that move. I mean, it's not every day you have a pitching coach that's been to 2 World Series, Justin, 2 college World Series appearances as a pitching coach in the market, and that's what it was at Mississippi State. I had her on the show. She loves Starkville. She's familiar with that state of Mississippi from her success at Ole Miss. I think Samantha Ricketts, that's a big home run considering to land somebody like Taryn Mowat. I love that move, and I think I'm interested to see the impact on Arizona, who brings in Christian Conrad to be the pitching coach in Arizona. That is one that very well. That those Wildcat, that's going to be a comparison there for the coming years.
No, it is, and I mean, what's going to happen there at Arizona from the pitching side? We'll see. Christian Conrad, he was the pitching coach at Loyola Marymount. Jenna Perez has had success at Loyola Marymount under his tutelage, so he's got that on his resume now. There are a lot of really high-powered pitching coaches and head coaches and people who've been around the game for a while who talk about how good of a coach Conrad is and will be. To me, I think we still need to see it. I think I still need to see a little bit on the field, but he's at Arizona now. Arizona's pitching staff is still Arizona's pitching staff. So the proof being in the pudding, the pudding's going to be there to show the proof. Mowat going to Mississippi State is a similar thing, but in a different way. Mississippi State made that super regional a couple of years ago, upsetting Florida State. I mean, you're still talking about a program that, similar to what I said about Oregon State, I think it was in the last podcast you and I did, but we've talked about so many things they run together. They made that super regional, but then last year they didn't make the NCAA tournament even, which is kind of the bar for an SEC team. Just make the tournament. They didn't. And so, for Taryn Mowat to step in at Mississippi State, she's got her work cut out for her as well. It's a big hire for Samantha Ricketts. It's a very high reward, low risk hire. Mowat, you mentioned even if you go back before Arizona and you look at what she did when she was at Ole Miss, you look at the track record just even before Arizona, and then you get to Arizona and some of the pitchers that she's worked with and what they've done when she was working with them. It's a big hire for Samantha Ricketts. It's an impactful hire for Samantha Ricketts. And just like you mentioned, there's a lot of moves around the SEC, but that Mowat hire, that's a big deal. I don't think a lot of people necessarily expected Mississippi State to be able to go and I'm just going to say this, make a splash hire the year after, the summer after missing the NCAA tournament. When you miss the NCAA tournament, especially as an SEC team, I feel like a lot of people think you're supposed to tread water. You're not supposed to be able to swim. Well, instead of just treading water, Samantha Ricketts went out and did a cannonball. Um, so it's a move that really I think will pay off well for Mississippi State and at a perfect time.
A couple other moves. One that I know you like, Georgia adding Amber Freeman from Cal. Talk about that and any other SEC moves that we have not brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about Georgia adding Amber Freeman, she was the pitching coach at Cal, obviously former Arizona State All American catcher. She was head coach at Vanguard in AIA for a few years. She's the pitching coach at Cal. Um, Georgia hired her to help with the offense. They hired her to work with the catchers. Different role than what she had at Cal. Um, Very different program that she stepped into. If you look at where Georgia is, Tony Baldwin has done a really nice job, whether it's transfers or whether it's staff, of making complementary moves since he got there. Tony, when he filled out his initial assistant coaching staff, to hire JT D'Amico away from Washington. D'Amico is a defensive guru, and you've seen that pay off in some of Georgia's defensive work. You have Chelsea Wilkinson, who was probably the first, the most eyebrow raising, okay, issue ready hire. And then you look at how Georgia's pitching staff did last year. Madison Kerpix developed. Shelby Walters did what she was supposed to do. The moves that Tony Baldwin has made have been very complimentary. And like I mentioned, from a transfer perspective as well, and the players he's added in addition to staff. You bring in Amber Freeman, you're bringing in somebody who was just a pitching coach to be help with the hitting, and it's like, well, what are you doing? But I think again, it's a very complimentary move. Freeman played in the Pac-12. She's coached in the Pac-12. D'Amico coached in the Pac-12. Freeman's been a head coach at a lower level. She's a catcher. That's a very complimentary move to what the rest of that staff has. I think it's got a lot of potential. I think that staff's got a lot of potential. And then around the SEC, I mean, we haven't talked deeply about Bryce Neal going to LSU, replacing Lindsay Leftwich when she went to NC State. I think the thing about that one was people looked at it and said, okay, well, who's going to do the hitting now? And I've talked to Bryce Neal. I've interviewed him. And I asked that very question: who's going to do the hitting? Are you the hitting coach? Is Howard Dobson still the hitting coach? The answer he gave me was it's a cumulative effort, but at the same time, this cumulative effort, Bryce Neal brings in aspects that LSU staff has not had. Um, and I think it's a high, it's got potential. It's a very there's a word I'm trying to come up with, but it's one that I think could really pay off for LSU because it seems a little weird from the outset. Beth Torina could have gone out and said, oh, I'm going to get a pitching coach and I'm going to leave the bullpen, be the program CEO. We've seen some coaches do that. Beth Torina could have gone out and said, I'm going to get a bona fide hitting coach and Howard's going to do something else. We've seen coaches do that. Just replace the hitting coach and the one who's there, do something else. She could have gone out and said, Howard's going to be the hitting coach. I'm going to bring in a defensive coach. She could have said, hey, I'm going to bring in an outfield coach. I could have bring in a catching coach. She went out and said, okay, you know what? Howard's done the hitting. I'm going to bring in a hitting coach, but the relationships that exist between them go so far back that their cohesion was going to be the most key of that. And from all accounts, that cohesion has been there so far. If that cohesion works as well as it could, and if Bryce Neal can bring to LSU what he brought to Louisville in his most recent stop before LSU, there's a lot of potential for what that can do at LSU. It's an old team. It's an old offense. You're not reinventing the wheel. You're just trying to win ball games. You're just trying to tweak things and make these players a little bit better. That's all you have to do. And if Bryce Neal can do that, that one has a potential to pay huge dividends for LSU.
You mentioned earlier you like Bloomer to Arizona. He, of course, comes to South Carolina. Your thoughts on Beverly Smith and her counter move to replacing Bloomer?
Well, if you look at Bev Smith's hires from a hitting coach perspective, go back to that 2017 summer. She hired Matt Lyle, which was kind of an interesting move at the time. She managed to woo Josh Bloomer away from Duke last year. This year, she brings in Jake Epstein. A guy knows his softball, has been around from a private coaching perspective. He's never coached collegiately. What he has done is worked with a lot of major league teams, coached a lot of major league baseball players. It's I don't want to sit here and say that Bev Smith makes gimmicky hires. She doesn't. But what I will say is even maybe especially her hires that on paper make you go, well, what if that's going to work? Tend to be the ones that work out the best. Um, so I think that's another one where I'm going to be very curious. Jake Epstein's history as a hitting coach, just in general, maybe not for college softball particularly, doesn't have the history, but his history as a hitting coach is pretty solid. The man's got a track record. If he can bring that track record in and have the success that some of Bev Smith's other hitting coach hires have had, she's going to look like a genius. And similar to what I said with Taryn Moet at Mississippi State, that if that happens, it's going to come at a perfect time for South Carolina, a much needed time for South Carolina.
All right, so those are some of the marquee moves in the SEC. Let's come over to some of the other conferences. You mentioned the ACC. Bryce Neal leaves Louisville, obviously, for LSU, as you mentioned. Give me a move or two. I mentioned earlier, obviously, of some of the ACC moves. What stands out as far as an assistant move in the ACC?
Well, I guess we got to start at Duke because they had to replace the hitting coach. Sidney Romero goes out to the Pac-12, goes to Oregon. They hired Taylor White away from Charlotte. Taylor White was part of Charlotte's climb to the top. I mean, you're talking about a top 35 RPI 2 years in a row Charlotte team, at large bid to the NCAA tournament last year. A lot of big time wins. White was part of that. She coached third base most of that time. She guided the offense for that time. Bring her into Duke. She's a Chapel Hill alum. She's Tar Heel alum, now coaching on the other side of Tobacco Road. But she also has familiarity with Marissa Young. Marissa Young was on staff at Chapel Hill when White was a player. So to bring in that familiarity, White also did a lot of recruiting stuff at Charlotte, and she knows that region incredibly well. So for Duke to bring her in as the hitting coach, I think it's a solid move, honestly. You look at the last couple of hires for Duke, even bringing in Josh Bloomer as the hitting coach, he was a guy who had success at the high school level. Okay, was it going to translate to the college level? Well, it did. Then you bring in Sidney Romero. I don't think we got enough time to see how were her effects as a hitting coach impactful or not. I mean, 1 year is not really a great sample size. But then you bring in White, who has, for the first time in the last, 3 hires, a marketable history at the collegiate level. So I'm really curious what that's going to mean for Duke. That's probably to me the biggest, most notable hire. You've got, for instance, Georgia Tech, where they replaced their entire assistant coaching staff. I think that's a place similar to what I've said about a couple of schools in other conferences where I need to see a splash. None of their hires were super splashy, but there's potential there. You replace the whole staff, cohesion. It's a word I've used already. What's that going to look like? What does it look like in terms of on the field? Is it slow developing or is it pretty quickly developing once you get to game time? Louisville replaced Neal, so replaced their hitting coach, hired a fourth paid assistant coach. Not similar to Georgia Tech, not super splashy hires. Um, you know, Potential, but at the same time, show me on the field. I don't need to see a splashy hire. If you don't make a splashy hire, that's great. You saw something in somebody who wasn't a splashy hire. Show me on the field. You look at the schools that changed hands from a head coaching perspective. Megan Smith Lyon brought her assistant coaching staff with her from Marshall to Chapel Hill. That includes Maddie Holub, a former Division II National Assistant Coach of the Year, really solid pitching coach. I really like the fact that she's now at the Power 5 level. NC State, you mentioned earlier, Mike Bosch is there now. I love that hire by Lindsay Leftwich. Bosch is a former ACC head coach. Even though maybe his bullpen wasn't the most successful at Florida, he's got that SEC experience on staff with Tim Walton. I think that's pretty invaluable as well. And then you go to Pitt. Jenny Allard reunites with Lacey Wood, who leaves the head coaching spot at Ball State to reunite with Allard. So Wood's the assistant. I'm really curious about Jordan Dale as the pitching coach at Pitt. That's one move that I kind of have my eye on that I'm curious for the potential there. I mean, she's never coached collegiately. She obviously had a track record as a player, first at Virginia Tech, then at Oregon. She's also played professionally. Never coached. So I'm curious to see what that does for Pitt. Again, I use the word cohesion when you get a new staff like that, kind of pulled from different parts. So, I mean, there was some change around the ACC. To me, White at Duke leads the way in terms of the notables. Um, but and then you saw like the Florida States and the Clemsons that kind of kept it pretty quiet. They bumped up their volunteer assistants into the fourth paid role. Um, and then Virginia Tech. I can't forget Virginia Tech and Virginia. I knew I was missing somebody. I had to go around the ACC map in my head. Virginia Tech, you bring in Josh Johnson as pitching coach. That's a really nice hire. That's who Taryn Moat replaced at Mississippi State. Josh Johnson's incredibly smart. He's incredibly smart. You also brought in a fourth paid assistant coach. I believe his name is Humel Mata. I probably butchered the pronunciation. Apologies to Mr. Mata. But an incredibly accomplished international player, a pitcher. So somebody who brings in just a totally different element, especially from a VP perspective, but also just his experience. But I really like the Johnson hire there at Virginia Tech. And then Virginia, Jeff Tilke is now the associate head coach. Jamie Allred is the assistant coach. I like those hires. I especially like the Allred hire. She's done really well. She's been pretty accomplished as an assistant coach, as a pitching coach. Most recently in North Texas, she was at Austin Peay before that. Joanna Harden was on staff at McNeese when Allred pitched at McNeese. She was her pitching coach. So there's that familiarity. I think that's pretty key too. But I like that coach, that move as well. The one thing I think the theme of the ACC is we got a lot of staffs that are 50% new, 75% new, maybe 100% new. That word cohesion that I keep going back to, I think it's going to be pretty key to keep an eye on in the ACC this year.
Well, you mentioned Allred now at Virginia. She takes over for Mike Roberts, who's now at Wisconsin. That was one of the bigger moves to me in the Big Ten from an assistant, is Mike Roberts joining Yvette Healy's staff after Verdon goes to Illinois, stays in the conference, but joins Tyra Perry's staff. There's an assistant coach. Give me your thoughts on those moves and some of the other highlights of the Big Ten.
Mike Roberts going to Wisconsin to me was the big one. That's a pretty big coup for Yvette Healy. Roberts is obviously accomplished player, pretty accomplished coach. He's been around. He's been a head coach. He was at Oregon. He was at Washington. He was at ULL. And then at Virginia, all as an assistant at Buffalo as a head coach as well. It's a return home for Mike Roberts too. So I think that's a pretty big key in why he made that move. But I really like that. To me, that's the biggest one in the Big Ten. I look around and I look at, for instance, Michigan State hiring Bethany Wells. Bethany Wells is a solid hitting coach. So I'm curious to see what impact she can have there. You mentioned Kirsten Verdon going to Illinois as the pitching coach. She's done well. She's been around a minute now. She's almost honestly, she's a veteran coach now, which seems odd as somebody who covered her playing career. But goes down to Illinois. That's a move worth watching. I even look over Indiana hiring Kendra Kirchhoff, who's still doesn't seem like she's too far out of her own playing career, but she's been on staff at Florida State, UCF, UNC Greensboro, so she's got some becoming a veteran coach in her own right. Even Ohio State, just a small move and bringing Kelsey Stewart in as their fourth paid assistant. Like that one to me is one that I'm kind of curious how that's going to go. I'm kind of curious what that's going to look like for them. So, I mean, you had a lot of Big Ten schools that made moves. Some, obviously, like a Mike Roberts, made more headlines maybe than others. But there's a lot that I think kind of could sneak under the radar potentially and have an impact here, have an impact there. I'm curious to see. There's a few that I've kind of got my eye on to see how they end up impacting and affecting their new programs.
A league has made a lot of moves as recent as last week. It's the Big 12. I don't know if you heard, Oklahoma State's made a move. I think we may have addressed that in the last episode. So we're not going to get into what you think of Vanessa Shippey and Carrie Eberle because we talked about them in the last episode. But they're new now to Oklahoma State in the staff. But that's part of a lot of moves. Kansas has a new pitching coach. That was also over the weekend. Just because, why wouldn't you make a hire before Christmas? Courtney Martinez leaves Iowa State to go to Utah. That's a big move there. Houston has a brand new staff. UCF brings in Becca Mueller, who I think is a rising star. A lot of people believe she has a bright future, could be a future head coach down the road. One of the better hitting coaches. Did great at Cal, Ball State before that, and at Georgia. Was a recent guest on In the Circle. She's now at UCF as the new hitting coach for Coach Ball Malone. Cassidy Brewer is on that staff, coming over from Florida. I've joked that was a trade between her and Francesca Anea, but that's whatever. Those are just some of the highlights, just some of the moves. We're not even talking about Texas Tech. They've got a new pitching coach because Paige Cassidy is now at NC State.
NC State.
Your thoughts on the Big 12? That's a lot of moves, so just go wherever direction you want to go.
Well, I mean, it is a lot of moves. If anybody's probably really happy right now, it's probably Glenn Moore because he didn't make any moves. He's probably the only one. No, I mean there are certainly some moves you mentioned Becca Mueller going to UCF. You look at what Cal's offense did last year, and the progress they made in the development there to become an NCAA to lead Cal back to the NCAA tournament, become an NCAA tournament team again. I give her high marks for that. That offense was a huge piece of how Cal did that. And for her to be at UCF, that's a pretty solid coup for Sydney Ball. I look around. You mentioned like in Iowa State, they hired Lindsey Ubrin, somebody who was on staff previously, has been a head coach. I think that's one. I mean, I don't know that you're going to see just major improvements in statistics, but it's somebody that I think can keep what Iowa State's got going. I think she's a good cog in that wheel there for Jamie Pinkerton at ISU. I do like that hire. She was doing some good things at Wagner and made Wagner into a quality program, a worthwhile program as head coach there for 6 years. You talk about Kansas. They hired Laura Heberling, who had been pitching coach at Maryland. I mean, that's somebody. I mean, Heberling's been around almost 2 decades. She was an NAIA head coach. She was on staff at Utah State. She was on staff at Maryland for a year. She's been around, and she's coached some solid pitching staffs. So for Kansas, I really like that, especially here in December, right at the end of the year, right at the semester break, to be able to luck into somebody like that being available. I think it's a big deal for Kansas. And then you look around, you mentioned, Texas hired a 4th paid coach. Oklahoma hired a 4th paid coach. Texas Tech hired a new pitching coach. So you've got some moves like that I think if they have an impact, we're going to see it. I think you're talking about probably some more low profile. I mean, is anything at Oklahoma low profile? Maybe, maybe not. But I think some of the moves that were made around the Big 12 too kind of are there. And I think we're going to see if they have a major impact or not. Based on kind of what happens during the course of the year. And even BYU, that they even had a couple of assistant coaching changes. They expanded to have the 4th paid coach and bumped up their former volunteer into a full-time role. So, I mean, a lot of moves around. And then you mentioned the Houston staff. I think that staff may be the one I'm most curious about. You bring in Nadia Taylor, who spent 1 year on staff at Michigan State as the hitting coach. You have Hope Troutwine, who's never coached before, is the pitching coach. I think it's a really interesting staff for a Power 5 program. They don't have a 4th paid, to the best of my knowledge. I'm not even sure they have a volunteer assistant coach. So it's just 3 of them, with Kristen Vesely as the head coach, of course. I think that staff probably is the one that makes me the most curious. Taylor only has that 1 year really measurable coaching experience. Troutwine's never coached at all. She's fresh out of school. She was a GA at Oklahoma last year. Both have played professionally Taylor's played for several years. Troutwine's played for a couple of years now. To me, that's a pretty high risk, but potentially a solid reward staff. I'm curious to see if that reward pays off. So I think Houston's changes to me may be the ones that make me the most curious, make me the most interested and intrigued.
Pac-12, I mentioned earlier, Victoria Haywood to Washington, like that move. You got Courtney Gano promoted up there in Washington. Obviously, Courtney Martinez has been a highly touted assistant, leaving Iowa State, as I mentioned, going to Utah, taking over for DJ Gasso. Those are some of the headliners in the Pac-12 as far as coaching hires. Your thoughts on Courtney Martinez to Utah there? And is that your top move of the Pac-12? Or is it Haywood?
No, Victoria Haywood is my top move in the Pac-12. And I'll tell you this, if you count the 4th paid coach, Every school in the Pac-12 experienced assistant coaching changeover this summer. All
Yeah.
9 of them. Even Stanford and UCLA. Stanford brought in Sarah Grunewagen just as their fourth paid. UCLA brought in Rob Schweier as their fourth paid. Arizona State brought in Haley Decker, hired her off staff at Pacific as their fourth paid. So if you count the fourth paid coach position, every staff in the Pac-12 saw some changeover this year. And actually, I lied. Josh Bloomer's my biggest move in the Pac-12. Hey,
We mentioned
outside of
him
that,
earlier. You mentioned him earlier. Yeah.
yes. Outside of that, it's Hayward though. I like the Hayward move to Washington. I do like the Martinez move to Utah. Martinez is one. She's had some good success as a coach, but she kind of just flies under the radar, kind of as a rule. She gets her work done in quiet. You don't hear her name thrown around a whole lot. She turned down a lot of jobs, including some head coaching jobs over the years, because she likes what she likes. She likes her status quo. That's what she's not going to just jump because the job, dangles something shiny in front of her, kind of thing. The Utah move for her made sense. I do like that move a lot. For Utah to have to replace DJ Gasso and try to build off this World Series year, Martinez is one of the few people who's got a shot at actually doing that. Honestly, of the moves in the Pac-12, Oregon State hired Matt Lyle as hitting coach, brought back Marcy Green as pitching coach, kind of at the 11th hour, just needing somebody on staff. Um, You've got Oregon hired Sydney Romero. And then Cal, I like the move of Cal hiring Danielle O'Toole as their pitching coach. O'Toole, obviously we know her playing career San Diego State, Arizona professionally, Olympics. Um, she did a good job with the pitchers at Cal State Fullerton. She did a really good job with the pitchers at Cal State Fullerton the last couple of years. Now she was a volunteer. Now she's a full-time coach at Cal. I really like that move for Cal. I'm not sure what to make of Cal's hitting coach hire. That's one that I think the jury's going to still be out on until I can see the results on the field. It's a travel ball coach and an NAIA coach or JUCO, I forget which. So it's had some success at that level in college, but also, it was at the travel ball level. So I'm curious to see how that's going to look for the Cal offense, especially trying to build off what they did last year. But I love the Danielle O'Toole hire for Cal. Little snapshot, little sneak peek. That's in the top 10 assistant coaching hires for me this year too.
Oh, okay.
I really like that hire for Cal to bring in O'Toole.
Kai Gibson, Utah too. I like Kai Gibson. Shout out there.
Yeah.
But that Heather Tar tree's growing, man. It's growing. Growing there by the minute. They're in the.
She's growing at a good bit herself too.
Well, I'll take your word. I haven't seen her since last year. There. So those are the moves in the Pac-12. Non-Power 5. Boy, that's going to be the last year we'll get to say non-Power 5, whatever you want to call it, mainstream conferences. My view, the top move was Katie Rickovic to Charlotte, reuniting with Ashley Chastain, taking over the offense. We had Ashley Chastain on the show. Obviously, they're both friends. They were at Ole Miss. Full disclosure, Katie Rickovic, in fact, introduced me to Ashley Chastain many years ago at the World Series, which you're quite familiar. You're very familiar with that story. That's my number top hire of the non-quote mainstream conferences. Yeah. Give me yours, notable ones.
I think my top one is probably Courtney Oliver going to Wichita State as the pitching coach. Presley Bell did a nice job as the pitching coach at Wichita.
Oliver obviously has been around. She was head coach at East Carolina. She was pitching coach at NC State. She played at Hofstra. Most recently, she was on staff at Houston. She's a veteran. She's coached a lot of softball. Coached a lot of softball pitching and pitchers. And Wichita bringing her in. I do like that move a lot. Outside of that one, I like San Diego State hiring Curly Grimes to replace Victoria Hayward, luring her away from Cal State Fullerton, where she had some good success and sustained success. I like that one. Dorian Shaw going to Delaware was one that I really liked. She was on staff at Purdue. I've talked about that Purdue staff or that Purdue success and all that, or lack thereof. But Dorian Shaw is not a bad coach. And to step in at Delaware, she stepped into a coaching / administrative role that I think they kind of created for her. I think there's a real potential for her to have a major impact there at a Delaware program that's already been successful in their own right. So it's just supplementing the success that's already been made. And then I'll give you one more. Shannon Billings is the married name. I apologize. Going to South Dakota State. She did a really nice job rebuilding the D3 program at Hardin Simmons. with virtually no resources. It's hard to rebuild a D3 program that's in the dumps, and she did it. Got him to the NCAA tournament. South Dakota State hiring her. She's got familiarity with Christina McSweeney from when they were both coaches at the D2 level in the state of Arkansas. I really think that hire has some serious potential there at South Dakota State. I really like the what Billings did at Hardin Simmons. I think you've really got one, maybe 2 more years, but really I think it's just 1 year left of South Dakota State's major championship window. So I think it's a good timing for that hire as well to bring in Shannon Billings, and see what she can do to help South Dakota State try to get back to the NCAA tournament.
I like the Oliver move, as you mentioned there, to Wichita, and then Shaw to Delaware. Delaware, what, could be the last year in the Colonial before they go to CUSA, or they got a year or two?
There's one more.
So they got one more year after this year.
Yeah, they'll move July 25.
Well, I'm glad you're keeping track, because I can't keep track with this.
I didn't say I was keeping track. I have notes. Notes are a wonderful
I'm
thing.
glad you do, because I'll be depending on you when you do your forecasts, who's playing where. And I'm not talking about
God
players. I'm talking about costs there.
God help me.
All right, so that should take care of all the coaching carousels. We didn't get to every one of them, because if we did, we would be here until 2025. But that is but Cody, if we did not mention you, we apologize, and you can certainly get back at us if you have success down the road, which has happened, by the way, many a times over the years. In fairness, there's been plenty of coaches that we probably haven't brought up that ended up doing just fine, and we're like, oh yeah, by the way, that turned out to be pretty good. We will not name names.
I still have some of the text messages.
I'm quite familiar. Yes, so am I.
Yep.
Before we let you go, give me your top game of the year in 20. What's a game that you're going to remember in 2023? I'll go first. I'll buy you some time. One that jumps out to me is LSU Louisiana. That game 7 regional, which had everything emotionally. Both coaches were spent. Coach Torino's it was just in a wild game, won by Louisiana. It just had a little bit of everything. Georgia Clark, the point that you got tossed, I believe. It was just crazy. LSU Louisiana regional final, probably the best game of that regional that I can recall, of that entire regional round, I should say. Certainly at Washington, coming from behind against McNeese is certainly a memorable one. I don't know if it was a great game. It was just a memorable comeback from what they did in the 7th inning. Certainly UCLA being upset by Grand Canyon and then bounced by Liberty. But the Grand Canyon game, that was a shocker. That could go down, Justin, and maybe the biggest upset in college softball NCAA tournament history. Shout out to Maribek Gorsuch, we had on the show talking about that. And Coach Hayes, they had a heck of a job. And then Liberty finishing the job, UCLA going 0-2. Those are the ones that sort of jump out to me. What jumps out to you?
Well, you mentioned Washington and McNeese. I think that's one that's going to live, well, I was going to say famously, but maybe infamously, for a lot of people, depending on which side you fall on. You mentioned ULL, the Cajuns, and LSU. That one was a big one. I'm gonna take you though one that's particularly memorable for me for a very different reason. I'm gonna take you back to February 26th. February 26th, week, I believe it was 3 of the season. UCLA was number 1 in the polls. Oklahoma had deseeded and dethroned at that point twice defending champion Oklahoma. Oklahoma, I believe, was number 2, and the 2 teams were scheduled to meet, and it was the highlight of the slate at the Mary Nutter tournament. Oklahoma had just lost to Baylor. UCLA's number 1, Oklahoma's not number 1. All this, they meet in Cathedral City. And it becomes what I can only describe as a shellacking, a whooping, as we say here in the South. Reason that one is so memorable to me, with apologies to the Bruin fan listeners, with apologies. The reason that one is so memorable to me is I think after that Baylor loss, Oklahoma's vulnerable. Clearly, that was a thought for some people. They dropped in the poll. They weren't number 1 anymore. After that UCLA win, I don't think anyone doubted Oklahoma again, probably to this day. I don't think anybody did. I don't think anybody has. I don't think anybody ever thought anybody but Oklahoma was going to win the Women's College World Series after that win over UCLA. Now, granted, we saw some discrepancies from UCLA later in the year. You mentioned their regional and loss and all that, but I think that game, right after their own loss, right after they fell from number one in the polls, to shut out UCLA, to run rule UCLA in a game that had that much hype. I think that was when Oklahoma pretty much told everybody and their brother, we lost a game, but we're going to win it all. And to me, that game might be outside of, like you mentioned, the Washington McNeese and, Grand Canyon upsetting you, like the ones that are memorable for a specific reason. I think that game might be the one that I remember because of that.
And that game aired on MLB Network on the MLB Network. It was that big that they put it on there.
Yeah.
With Oklahoma rough with UCLA. I'll mention the World Series game, Stanford, Oklahoma. It was a tremendous game. Kennedy became a star at Stanford there, obviously. And it was great to see the Stanford alums there. The World Series, that's a memory I'll never forget. But Stanford, Oklahoma, that was a great game.
Yeah.
And I think could be a lot of people's pick in 2024. Could be
if you were going to ask me of games that I've seen that I saw in person, that absolutely
is that your best game in person?
Truth be told, the two Stanford Oklahoma games.
Yeah,
honestly,
I agree with that. 100%. Yeah. Put those two in there. That would be it. So, all right, that's it, Justin. That's it. It's the wrap on 2023. Sir, any final thoughts?
God help us.
What a way to go! What a final words in 2023.
No, it's been a wild year. I'm really eager on a lot of fronts to see what 24's got in store.
Amen to that, sir. And glad that you're around, healthy, and working. Back to breaking stories. Although, please, can you not break stories on around the holidays? Are you not going to break something on New Year's Day? Are you?
Not if I can help it.
Fair, thank you. That's Justin McLeod, the Dugout Digest. If he does break a story, it'll be there. Where can they find it?
It's the Dugout Digest, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. DugoutDigestSB.com is the website.
Thank you, Justin. Have a happy new year. We'll talk to you in the new year.
Appreciate you.